This story is called Mom Disowned Me for Not Supporting My Sister's Wedding, so I Took Back My House and Left Her Homeless. Hi, Reddit. Growing up, it was always clear who my mom's favorite child was. My mom, Karen, 62 female, has 2 daughters, me, 42 female, and my younger sister Rachel, 37 female. From the moment Rachel was born, it felt like I faded into the background. I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, that's just the reality. Rachel was born underweight and unwell, so my mom became fiercely protective of her. I get that it must have been terrifying for her, but instead of Rachel just being the baby of the family, she became the only child that mattered to Karen. Rachel was this fragile little thing, and Mom treated her like a princess. Everything revolved around Rachel. Her wants, her needs, her moods. For instance, Rachel didn't like eating by herself, so Mom would hand-feed her until she was well into middle school. When Rachel had homework or school projects, Mom would do them for her. If Rachel didn't feel like going to school, Mom would just let us stay home without question. And then there was me. It's not like I was neglected. I had food, clothes, and all the basics. But emotionally, I was left to fend for myself. Mom didn't take an interest in my life unless it was somehow tied to Rachel. I'll never forget the time I was about 10 years old and had a dentist appointment. Mom forgot to pick me up because she was at the spa. I ended up waiting outside the school for hours until a family friend noticed me and gave me a ride home. When I finally got back, Mom acted like it wasn't a big deal, brushing it off with, "Oh, I thought you'd figure it out." Still, as much as Dad tried, the favoritism was impossible to ignore. Rachel always got the best of everything, while I had to work for what I wanted. One Christmas, I asked for a bike, and Rachel decided last minute she wanted one too. On Christmas morning, there was a shiny new bike under the tree for Rachel. I got a pair of socks. When I asked why, Mom said, "You're older, you can save up and buy one yourself." It wasn't just about the material things, though. Karen was obsessed with Rachel's happiness. If Rachel had the tiniest issue, like a friend not texting her back or a bad grade, Mom would swoop in to fix it. But if I was upset about something, I was told to stop being dramatic or figure it out like an adult. It didn't take long for me to stop going to her for anything. Rachel, of course, soaked it all up. Why wouldn't she? She was living the dream. She didn't have to lift a finger because Mom did everything for her. Rachel never learned basic life skills. She couldn't cook, clean, or even manage her own schedule because Mom shielded her from everything, making her completely dependent. By the time Rachel reached high school, the toxic dynamic became painfully clear. If Rachel struggled with her classes, she'd cry to Mom, and Mom would do her assignments for her. When Rachel failed high school, Mom blamed the teachers, claiming they didn't understand Rachel's unique needs. She even argued with the principal to get her grades changed. It didn't work, of course, but it showed just how far Karen would go to protect Rachel from facing any accountability. Meanwhile, I was expected to be self-reliant. If I struggled in school, I had to figure it out alone. If I wanted to join extracurricular activities, I had to pay for them with babysitting money. And if I dared to complain, Karen would remind me, "You're the older sister. You need to set an example." By the time I graduated high school, I couldn't wait to leave. I got into a college in another city and never looked back. Moving away was the best decision I ever made. For the first time, I could breathe. I didn't have to compete with Rachel or fight for Karen's attention. I could finally be myself. Rachel, on the other hand, stayed home. She didn't move out until she got married at 26. Even then, Karen was constantly involved in her life, calling 5 times a day to ask questions like, "What did you eat? What are you wearing? How's your husband?" She even showed up unannounced to clean Rachel's house or drop off groceries, things Rachel and her husband were perfectly capable of doing themselves. As for me, I'd built a life of my own. I graduated college, got a job, and started planning for the future. Dad stayed in touch, calling regularly and visiting when he could. Karen, not so much. She'd occasionally send a text on my birthday or comment on a Facebook post, but that was about it. Honestly, I didn't mind. I was happier without her constant criticism and favoritism weighing me down. Looking back, I think Karen's obsession with Rachel wasn't just about love. It was about control. She wanted Rachel to need her forever, so she never let her grow up. Meanwhile, I was pushed out of the nest early and forced to fend for myself. At the time, it hurt, but now I see it as a blessing. I learned to stand on my own, while Rachel remained entirely reliant on Karen. Even after I moved away, nothing changed. Rachel stayed the golden child, Karen stayed her enabler, and I stayed the forgotten one. It's funny, not in a ha-ha way, but in a sad way, how some things never change. 11 years ago, though, everything shifted. Dad started coughing a lot. At first, it didn't seem serious. He thought it was allergies or a stubborn cold. But weeks turned into months, and his condition worsened. He became constantly tired, struggled to breathe, and just wasn't himself. Still, he kept working because that's who he was, hard-working, selfless, and always putting others first. Karen, my mom, barely seemed to acknowledge what was happening. Her days were filled with spa visits, yoga classes, and whatever else kept her occupied. My sister, Rachel, who had moved back home after her first marriage ended, wasn't working and didn't seem concerned about Dad's health either. It was like neither of them wanted to face the inconvenience of dealing with reality. At the time, I was living in another city, focused on advancing my career and keeping some distance from the family drama. Dad and I talked regularly, and during our calls, I could tell something was off. His voice was weaker, and he sounded tired all the time. When I asked if he had seen a doctor, he brushed it off, insisting he was fine, but I knew better. Things came to a head when a particularly bad coughing fit landed him in the hospital. The diagnosis was a severe lung infection. I dropped everything and rushed home the moment I found out. When I arrived, I was horrified to see Dad lying in bed looking frail and unwell, and alone. Karen and Rachel? They were out getting their nails done. When they returned, Karen seemed surprised to see me. She even tried to hug me, but I wasn't in the mood. I asked why she was with Dad, and she made some excuse about running errands. It was obvious they'd just come from the spa. They were freshly manicured and carrying shopping bags. The hospital admitted Dad, and I stayed with him as much as I could. Karen would stop by occasionally, but only for a few minutes at a time. Rachel barely visited, claiming it was too hard for her to see Dad like that. Meanwhile, I was the one juggling everything, speaking with doctors, managing his medication, and keeping him comfortable. I even spent most nights sleeping in a chair by his bed. Karen's lack of involvement was infuriating. She didn't work, so it wasn't like she was too busy to be there, yet she acted as though visiting the hospital was a huge inconvenience. I'll never forget when she said, "He's in good hands with the nurses. What am I supposed to do? Just sit there." Yes, Karen, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Be there for your husband. After a week in the hospital, Dad was discharged, but he required constant care at home. We hired a nurse to help, but Karen was supposed to take on more responsibility. As expected, she was unreliable. She'd forget to give him his medication on time or leave the house for hours, returning with shopping bags. Once, she was supposed to pick up an oxygen tank for him, but she stopped at the salon first. By the time she got home, I had already arranged for someone else to deliver it. Rachel was no better. She claimed she couldn't handle seeing Dad in such a vulnerable state, so she avoided him entirely. She spent most of her time in her room, scrolling through her phone or watching TV. During one of Dad's worst health episodes, she even went on vacation with her friends, leaving me to handle everything alone. Eventually, I quit my job to take care of Dad full-time. I didn't trust Karen or Rachel, and honestly, I didn't want to leave him alone with them. Dad deserved better. I cooked his meals, helped him with physical therapy, and kept him company so he wouldn't feel isolated. It was exhausting, but I loved him, and I would do it all over again if I had to. As Dad's condition worsened, Karen made more of an effort, but it was too late by then. She would sit by his side, but she was always glued to her phone, either posting on social media or chatting with Rachel. And Rachel? She only came around when Karen guilt-tripped her, and even then she'd make excuses to leave after a few minutes. Dad passed away a few months later. He spent his final moments surrounded by me, the nurse, and a couple of close friends who had come to say goodbye. Karen and Rachel? They weren't there. Karen was at a wellness retreat and Rachel was out with friends. I had called both of them when it became clear that Dad didn't have much time left, but neither of them showed up. The funeral was a blur. I was heartbroken and exhausted, but I still had to deal with Karen and Rachel's nonsense. Karen spent most of the service chatting with her friends about how unexpected Dad's death was, as though she hadn't been ignoring the signs for months. Rachel cried loudly, putting on a dramatic display of grief that felt completely fake. She hadn't cared when it mattered. A few weeks after the funeral, I got a call from Dad's lawyer about his will. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a small inheritance or a sentimental keepsake. But when I met with the lawyer, I was stunned. Dad had left everything to me. The house, his savings, his estate. Karen and Rachel got nothing. It broke my heart to think about how much pain Dad must have felt in his final months, knowing how little his wife and youngest daughter cared about him. Leaving everything to me was his way of showing that he saw me, that he appreciated everything I had done for him. I moved back to the city where I had been working, focused on rebuilding my life. Eventually, I met my husband, got married, had a baby, and moved overseas for his job. It was a fresh start, and honestly, I didn't feel the need to tell Karen or Rachel about any of it. Years later, after I gave birth to my daughter, Karen showed up at my house out of the blue. I hadn't spoken to her in years, so seeing her at my doorstep was a shock. She looked different, less polished, more tired. She cried, apologized, and said she wanted to be part of my daughter's life. Karen admitted she regretted how she had treated me when I was growing up, saying the guilt had been eating at her since Dad passed. She claimed she wanted to make amends. I'll admit, I didn't trust her motives, but I decided to give her a chance. At first, things seemed fine. Karen would video call to check on my daughter and occasionally send gifts. For once, it felt almost normal. But, as I expected, the subtle hints began soon after. Karen would casually mention how hard things had been for her financially, or complain about how difficult life was since I took everything. I ignored her comments, hoping they would stop. A month ago, Karen called, sounding unusually cheerful, which immediately raised red flags. Karen rarely called unless she wanted something. The conversation started with small talk about my daughter and husband, which was odd in itself, and then she dropped the bombshell. Rachel was getting married again. Oh. If you've read my earlier posts, you'll know Rachel's first marriage ended after a year, and she moved back in with Karen, never really getting her life back on track. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in over 10 years, so this news caught me off guard. Karen went on and on about how important this wedding was for Rachel, calling it a fresh start for her and a chance to bring happiness to the family. I was polite, congratulating her, and assumed that would be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Karen eventually got to the point. She said something like, Rachel's had a tough time planning this wedding on her budget. She deserves a beautiful day after all she's been through. I stayed silent because I knew what was coming. Finally, she said it. I was hoping you could help cover the expenses. It's the least you could do considering everything your father left you. I was stunned. First of all, Rachel and I don't even talk. Second, how entitled do you have to be to ask someone to pay for a wedding they're not even invited to? And yes, Karen made it clear I wasn't on the guest list. When I pointed this out, Karen backpedaled, saying, "Oh, we assumed you wouldn't want to travel with the baby, but of course you're welcome. You don't need an invite, it's your sister's wedding." I told her flat out no, I wasn't paying for anything. Karen tried to guilt me, saying it was my duty as the older sister to help Rachel. She even brought up Dad's inheritance, accusing me of hoarding the family fortune while Rachel struggled. I reminded her that Rachel and I had no relationship and suggested Rachel reach out to me directly if she needed help. Unsurprisingly, Rachel never did. Karen didn't accept my refusal. Over the next few weeks, she bombarded me with texts and voicemails, all variations of the same argument. I was selfish, I didn't care about family, and I was letting Rachel down. She even said, "If you don't help, it'll ruin Rachel's big day and everyone will know it's your fault." The irony of their entitlement wasn't lost on me. Where were they when I needed help? When Dad was sick, I was the one who dropped everything to care for him, while they carried on with their lives. Now, after years of silence, they expected me to swoop in and save the day? Absolutely not. Karen escalated things, claiming Rachel had already booked the venue and paid deposits for decorations, catering, and musicians. She said canceling everything would humiliate the family since invitations had already been sent out. I asked her how they had planned all this if they couldn't afford it. Her answer? "We were counting on you." That was my breaking point. I told Karen to figure it out herself because I wasn't giving them a single penny. She started crying, saying, "If you don't help, I'll have no choice but to cut you out of my life." I laughed and replied, "You already treated me like I didn't exist. What's the difference?" Then I hung up and blocked her. My husband fully supported my decision, but warned me there might be backlash from extended family. He was right. A few relatives reached out, urging me to be the bigger person because family is family. Where was this concern when Karen and Rachel treated me like dirt? I ignored them and stood my ground. Karen's final message was a voicemail. She said, "If you can live with ruining your sister's wedding, then I guess you're not the person I thought you were." I didn't respond and don't plan to. I've spent too much of my life bending over backward for people who don't appreciate it. I'm done. After the wedding drama, I reached my limit. Karen and Rachel had been living rent-free in the house Dad left me for over a decade. Part of me thought letting them stay was easier than dealing with the fallout of kicking them out, especially so soon after Dad passed. But over time I realized they had no gratitude, no respect for me, and no intention of ever being decent. Let's rewind to when Dad's will was read. Karen and Rachel were furious that he left everything to me. Karen argued the house was hers because she had lived there for decades. Rachel threw a tantrum, screaming about how unfair it was. But the truth is, neither of them deserved anything. Dad left me the house because he saw how much I cared for him during his final months, while they couldn't even bother to show up most of the time. Leaving everything to me was his way of saying, "I see you and I appreciate you." Despite inheriting the house, I let them stay. I thought, maybe, just maybe, they would change. Instead, Karen acted like the house was hers, renting out a room to cover her expenses without ever offering me rent. Rachel painted me as the villain, spreading rumors that I had manipulated Dad into excluding her from the will. They made no effort to repair our relationship, yet happily lived in a house they didn't pay for. Fast forward to now. After Karen's outrageous request for wedding money and her manipulative behavior, I decided I'd had enough. I contacted my lawyer and had an eviction notice drafted. When Karen received it, she lost her mind. She called me, screaming, "You can't evict me. This is my home. I've lived here for 45 years. I calmly reminded her that the house was legally mine and she had 30 days to leave. Rachel, of course, jumped in, calling me every name imaginable and accusing me of being greedy and heartless. She claimed I had only cared for Dad to secure the inheritance. It was laughable, considering she had barely visited Dad during his final days. Karen tried every trick to make me change my mind. First she acted defiant, saying, "I dare you to kick me out. I'm not going anywhere." Then she softened, crying that she was too old to start over and that the house was all she had left. She even mentioned how she'd been renting out a room to make ends meet, as if that justified her actions. I should have been earning rental income from the house for years, but nothing ever went as planned. The breaking point was when she tried to guilt me by asking, "What would your father think if he saw you throwing your mother out on the street?" I responded by saying that Dad left me the house for a reason. Maybe if she'd cared about him even half as much as she prioritized her spa appointments, he might still be alive. I know it was a harsh thing to say, but I was done sugarcoating the truth. Karen made her decisions, and now she had to deal with the consequences. Rachel wasn't pleased about the eviction either. She told Karen to move in with her temporarily, but not without making a grand spectacle of it. Rachel contacted every relative, boasting about how she was stepping up for Karen and claiming she didn't need anything from me. The entire act felt insincere, as if she was looking for applause for doing the bare minimum. Karen moved out on the 26th day of the 30-day notice. I didn't even bother showing up. Instead, I hired a property manager to oversee the handover. Once the house was empty, I had it cleaned and renovated, then decided to rent it out to a family friend's brother, someone I could trust. It felt satisfying to know the house would finally be used by people who valued it. Meanwhile, Rachel's elaborate wedding plans crumbled because I refused to finance them. She had to scale back from a luxurious lakeside venue to a town hall, which caused considerable embarrassment in their social circle. Even Rachel's fiancé wasn't happy. He hadn't wanted an extravagant wedding in the first place. Rachel had apparently promised him she'd find a way to pay for it, which obviously meant my sister will foot the bill. Not long after Karen moved in with Rachel, I started hearing rumors about problems in their household. Rachel's husband wasn't thrilled about having his mother-in-law as a permanent guest. As usual, Karen couldn't resist interfering. She criticized Rachel's cooking, commented on how her husband managed the household, and generally made herself unwelcome. A few relatives have tried to guilt me into forgiving Karen and Rachel, saying I'd gone too far and should have let Karen stay in the house. Honestly, I couldn't care less. These were the same people who stayed silent while I was being mistreated, so their opinions mean nothing to me now. Before diving into the final update, I have a quick request. We put a lot of effort into finding these incredible stories every day, and your support means the world to us. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us grow and allows us to continue bringing you amazing stories. Thank you. And now, on to the last update. Here's the final chapter of this saga. After Karen moved in with Rachel, I thought I could finally relax. I had leased out the house, focused on my own family, and cut off most of the toxic relatives who tried to pressure me into forgiving Karen and Rachel. For a while, I didn't hear anything from them, and honestly, I was relieved. Of course, the peace didn't last. About 2 months after the eviction, a mutual relative messaged me, asking if I'd heard about what happened with Karen and Rachel. I hadn't, and truthfully, I wasn't sure I cared, but curiosity eventually got the better of me. When I asked about the situation, what I heard was both maddening and oddly satisfying. Apparently, Rachel's husband, Chris, had finally reached his limit with Karen's interference and issued Rachel an ultimatum: either Karen leaves or he does. Rachel was already on shaky ground with Chris due to the wedding fiasco. Remember how she had promised him an extravagant ceremony that I was supposed to fund? When that didn't pan out, they had to settle for a modest town hall wedding, which deeply embarrassed Rachel in front of her social circle and his family. Chris had previously warned her not to overspend, but she ignored him, creating significant strain in their relationship. Karen's presence in their home only made things worse. Karen constantly criticized Chris's cooking, his parenting, they have a toddler, and even the way he spoke to Rachel. She also made suggestions about how they should manage their money, which was ironic given her own financial chaos. Chris tried to endure it, but after one particularly heated argument in which Karen accused him of not being man enough to provide for his family, Chris put his foot down. He told Rachel it was either him or Karen. Rachel begged him to reconsider, but he stood firm. Here's the twist. Karen didn't leave quietly. When Rachel informed her of Chris's ultimatum, Karen lost her temper. She accused Rachel of abandoning her like everyone else, and even threatened to cut Rachel out of her will, an empty threat since Karen has nothing to leave behind. This escalated into a massive argument, and Rachel, both embarrassed and exasperated, told Karen to figure out her own situation. So, where did Karen go? Unsurprisingly, she tried to contact me. She sent me an email, since I had blocked her everywhere else, pleading for me to reconsider letting her move back into the house. In the email, she lamented how life had been cruel to her and claimed she had always done her best as a mother. She even framed it as a chance for us to mend our relationship. I didn't bother responding. By this point, her manipulative behavior was just pathetic. When I ignored her, Karen turned to extended family members, attempting to guilt them into letting her stay. Most flatly refused, likely because they've witnessed her antics before. One distant cousin agreed to take her in temporarily, but Karen's stay lasted only 3 weeks. The cousin grew tired of her constant demands and non-stop complaints, eventually asking her to leave. Meanwhile, Rachel is now dealing with the aftermath of her choices. Chris hasn't left her, but their marriage is reportedly on shaky ground. Between the wedding expenses, Karen's drama, and Rachel's unwillingness to take responsibility for her actions, Chris has started distancing himself both emotionally and financially. He even suggested couples counseling, but Rachel has been telling everyone that Chris is the problem, not her. I also heard Rachel complaining to family about how unfair it is that I inherited everything from Dad. According to her, none of this would have happened if I had just shared the inheritance. Conveniently, she leaves out the part where she and Karen ignored Dad during his final days and painted me as the bad guy for caring about him. With them, it's always someone else's fault. Despite all their chaos, things have been going well for me. Renting out the house was one of the best decisions I've ever made. The tenants are a lovely family who genuinely appreciate and care for the space. The rental income has given me financial stability and allowed me to invest in my daughter's future. My husband and I are thriving in our careers, and we've even started planning a much-needed family vacation. As for Karen and Rachel, they made their choices and are now living with the consequences. Karen is still bouncing between relatives' couches, and Rachel is stuck in a marriage that seems to be falling apart. I don't wish them harm, but I also don't care anymore. Their problems are no longer my burden, and that realization has been incredibly liberating. Thank you for all your support throughout this journey. Take care, and thanks again for everything.